To the pilots of the British Royal Air Force, shivering in the damp, freezing fog of late 1941, it was not a weapon. It was a literal death trap. To the high command of the United States Army Air Forces, it was a pathetic, underpowered embarrassment of American engineering, a multi-million-dollar mistake relegated to secondary, forgotten theaters of war. British test pilots took one look at its bizarre design, flew it through the gray English skies, and immediately canceled their massive orders. They deemed it utterly useless against the lethal, high-altitude sweeps of the German Luftwaffe. It was slow, it was heavy, and it gasped for oxygen the moment it climbed past 12,000 feet. To the Western Allies, this plane was dead on arrival. The condemnation was swift and absolute. "It is a flying coffin," one American test pilot reportedly muttered after surviving a harrowing landing. The aircraft was accused of possessing a fatal aerodynamic instability, a terrifying tendency to snap into an unrecoverable flat spin at the slightest touch of the controls. American aviators feared the heavy Allison engine sitting directly behind their backs, terrified that in a crash, the motor would break free from its mounts and crush them to death. It was an aircraft born of radical ideas, but crippled by compromise, seemingly destined to be melted down for scrap metal or left to rot in training fields. Yet this exact same aircraft, the despised, rejected Bell P-39 Airacobra, would undergo one of the most shocking redemptions in military history. On the brutal, frozen steppes of the Eastern Front, this American junk became the single most lethal weapon in the Soviet arsenal. While Western pilots refused to fly it, Soviet super aces painted red stars on its nose and used it to utterly butcher the elite of Hitler's Luftwaffe. In the hands of desperate, battle-hardened Russian pilots, the Airacobra was not a failure, it was a scalpel. How did an aircraft considered a joke in the West become the favorite warbird of the Soviet Union's deadliest aces? The answer lies in a fundamental misunderstanding of the P-39's design and a radical, low-altitude tactical revolution pioneered by a single Soviet genius, Alexander Pokrishkin. Pokrishkin, a brilliant tactical theorist who would rise to become the second highest-scoring Allied ace of World War II, did not see a failure when he looked at the P-39. He saw a horizontal dog-fighting monster. He realized that while the plane choked in the thin air over London, the air war in Russia was fought down in the mud at altitudes below 10,000 feet, supporting tanks and infantry. At these lower altitudes, the unsupercharged Allison engine did not suffocate, it thrived. The P-39's heavy, nose-mounted 37mm autocannon, which Western pilots complained was too slow and clumsy, was treated by Soviet aces like sniper artillery. A single high-explosive round from this monstrous weapon could tear a wing off a Junkers bomber or vaporize a Focke-Wulf in a single devastating blow. To the German pilots who watched their wingmen explode into dust in the skies over Kuban, the P-39 was no longer a joke. It was a terrifying specter they called the Cobra. This is the story of how American engineering, stripped of its Western constraints and paired with Soviet tactical audacity, turned a rejected underdog into the ultimate hunter of the Eastern Front. This is the untold story of the P-39 Airacobra's Red Redemption. To understand why the Airacobra became the most hated aircraft in the West, you have to understand the mind of its creator. In the late 1930s, a young, ambitious aviation visionary named Lawrence Larry Bell, along with his brilliant chief designer, Robert Woods, set out to break every established rule of military aviation. They did not want to build a standard fighter and squeeze weapons into its wings. They wanted to build a flying gun platform. Their starting point was a behemoth, the Oldsmobile 37mm T9 autocannon. But a weapon of this scale, with its massive receiver, heavy recoil mechanisms, and a drum holding dozens of high-explosive shells, presented a critical problem. There was simply no room in the nose for both the gun and a massive piston engine. Woods solved this puzzle with an engineering choice that was as daring as it was insane. He shoved the 1,150 horsepower Allison V1710 engine behind the cockpit. This moved the center of mass to the middle of the airframe, freeing up the entire nose to house the massive 37mm cannon. But this revolutionary layout introduced a terrifying mechanical nightmare. Power had to be delivered to the propeller via a 10-foot-long steel drive shaft. This shaft ran directly through the center of the cockpit, spinning at over 3,000 RPM, inches beneath the pilot's seat, and passing right between their legs. The physical sensation in the cockpit was overwhelming. The cabin smelled of hot oil and high-octane gasoline, while the intense vibration of the spinning drive shaft rattled the pilot's bones, serving as a constant, nerve-shredding reminder of the massive forces rotating just below their lower anatomy. On paper, this configuration was a masterstroke of aerodynamic packaging. When the prototype, designated the XP-39, first took flight in April of 1938, it was a world-beater. Armed with a cutting-edge, exhaust-driven turbo supercharger, the prototype tore through the sky at a blistering 390 miles per hour and climbed effortlessly into the thin, freezing air of the upper troposphere. It possessed the speed, altitude, and firepower to intercept any bomber on Earth. But just as Bell was preparing to change the face of aerial warfare, the project was derailed by bureaucratic short-sightedness. In 1939, the United States Air Corps, operating under peacetime budgets and outdated pre-war tactical doctrines, made a catastrophic decision. Anxious about production delays, maintenance complexity, and drag from the turbo supercharger's external ducting, they ordered the supercharger to be completely removed from all production models. It was a fatal blow to the Airacobra's heart. Stripped of its mechanical lung, the Allison engine was reduced to a naturally aspirated power plant. At sea level, it was still a thoroughbred, but past 12,000 feet, where the thin air starved the engine of oxygen, the P-39 was physically suffocating. Its climb rate plummeted, its top speed decayed, and the once revolutionary interceptor was transformed into a sluggish, underpowered target for the nimble, high-altitude Messerschmitts of Western Europe. But the lack of high-altitude performance was not the most terrifying flaw of the Airacobra. The mid-engine layout introduced a deadly aerodynamic paradox. When the aircraft was fully loaded with fuel, water, and 37mm ammunition, its center of gravity was stable. But as the pilot engaged the enemy, burning fuel from the wing tanks and firing the heavy ammunition in the nose, the front of the plane became dangerously light. The center of mass shifted rapidly backward. In a high-speed turn, if a pilot pulled back on the stick too aggressively, the light nose would suddenly pitch up, stalling the wings. The Airacobra would instantly snap into a flat spin. In a flat spin, the centrifugal forces were so violent that the pilot was pinned against the cabin walls, unable to reach the controls. Because of Larry Bell's unique car-style doors, which opened outward rather than sliding back like a standard canopy, escaping a spinning Airacobra was a death sentence. To open the door, the pilot had to fight the crushing G-forces. If they somehow managed to push the door open and leap into the screaming void, the rearward weight bias meant the tailplane was tilted forward, frequently striking and killing the pilot before their parachute could ever deploy. To the Allied pilots assigned to fly it, the P-39 was no longer an engineering marvel, it was a psychological horror story.
They abandoned the aircraft, leaving thousands of crated Airacobras sitting on rain-swept docks, waiting for a savior who actually understood how to wield them.
This was the crisis point of the global war. Thousands of brand-new, factory-fresh Airacobras were packed into wooden crates stacked high on rain-swept docks from Newark to Montreal. The Western Allies were prepared to write them off, to let them rot or dump them into the ocean as steel salvage. They were considered a liability, a waste of young pilot lives. But across the world, on a front line stretching over 1,500 miles of blood-soaked muddy earth, a desperate red giant was about to inherit these rejected fighters. What happened next in the freezing, smoke-choked skies of the East would shock the global military high command. If you love uncovering the forgotten military history the textbooks tried to sweep under the rug, hit that subscribe button right now. Every single week, we unmask the untold stories of the warbirds, the engineers, and the battles that shaped our world. Join our squadron, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and let's head to the Eastern Front. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, unleashing the most veteran, terrifying air force on the planet. In the opening 24 hours, the Soviet VVS was virtually annihilated, losing over 2,000 aircraft, most of them bombed into burning heaps of metal before their pilots could even turn the magnetos. The Soviet Union was fighting for its absolute physical survival. Desperate for anything with wings to halt the German panzer divisions, the Kremlin pleaded for immediate Western aid. Through the ice-locked, U-boat-infested sea lanes of the Arctic convoys and across the mountainous, dust-blown tracks of the Persian corridor, the first Lend-Lease P-39s began to arrive. To the Soviet mechanics working in sub-zero blizzards, this was not American junk, it was a lifeline. When the crated aircraft arrived in the winter of 1942, Soviet crews faced an immediate, baffling puzzle. The cockpits were fitted with advanced instruments, tricycle landing gear, and luxury features unheard of in rugged, Spartan Russian planes, including cabin heaters. But the instruction manuals were written entirely in English. Without translators, Soviet engineers and mechanics had to reverse engineer the assembly by sheer intuition, working in mud-slicked, open-air frontline fields where the temperatures dropped below -30 degrees. They quickly discovered that this bizarre, mid-engined American fighter possessed a hidden secret, one that the high-altitude doctrines of the West had completely blinded them to.
To understand why the P-39 succeeded in Russia, you must throw out everything you know about the air war over Germany. In the West, victory was decided in the stratosphere. In the East, the sky was merely an extension of the mud. There were no strategic bomber fleets to intercept at 25,000 feet. Instead, the Soviet VVS operated as a flying artillery arm built around the legendary heavily armored Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik. The Sturmoviks flew at treetop level, savage bombing German panzer divisions. To protect their tanks, the German Luftwaffe was forced to fly down into the thick, dense air below 10,000 feet. And down in this low-altitude arena, the P-39 was no longer suffocating. It was a predator. At these lower altitudes, the omission of the turbo supercharger was no longer a fatal flaw. The thick, heavy air of the Russian plains provided all the atmospheric pressure the Allison engine needed. Manifold pressure surged. The engine ran cool, delivering its full, uninterrupted 1,150 horsepower directly to the propeller. The P-39's unique mid-engine design, which made it unstable in high-altitude maneuvers, turned it into a horizontal acrobat close to the ground. It could turn tighter, accelerate faster, and dive more violently than almost any German fighter it encountered. But before the Airacobra could be unleashed in its full glory, Soviet engineers had to perform some radical battlefield surgery.
Soviet frontline engineers, led by brilliant field technicians of the 216th Fighter Aviation Division, immediately identified the plane's most dangerous vice, its tendency to enter the dreaded flat spin. They realized that when the ammunition in the nose was depleted, the center of gravity slipped too far rearward. Their solution was simple, brutal, and highly effective. They stripped out the 4 wing-mounted 30-caliber machine guns along with their heavy ammunition boxes and feed chutes. This shed hundreds of pounds from the outer wings, dramatically reducing the aircraft's roll inertia. They then recalculated the ballast, ensuring the center of gravity remained firmly locked forward, even when the nose guns were dry. The terrifying flat spin characteristic was instantly cured. But the engineers didn't stop there. The Airacobra's highly advanced tricycle landing gear, which American pilots had criticized as too delicate for rough fields, became the ultimate frontline advantage. Traditional tail-dragger fighters, like the Soviet Yakovlevs or the German Messerschmitts, had a dangerous tendency to nose over, flipping onto their backs and crushing their pilots when landing on thick, clay-like mud of Russian spring runways. The P-39's nose wheel changed everything. It allowed Soviet pilots to slam on their brakes with absolute impunity, landing on waterlogged, cratered dirt strips that would have destroyed any other fighter in the world. The rejected American underdog was now armed, balanced, and perfectly adapted to the most brutal theater of war in human history.
The weapon was now perfected. It only needed a master to wield it. That master was Alexander Ivanovich Pukrishkin. A former mechanic turned fighter pilot, Pukrishkin possessed a clinical, mathematical mind that detested the rigid, outdated pre-war Soviet dogmas. While Soviet commanders demanded pilots fly in flat, defensive circles close to the ground, Pukrishkin spent his nights drafting complex geometric flight paths in a small pocket notebook. In early 1943, as his unit, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment was equipped with the P-39, Pukrishkin recognized that the American fighter's exceptional cockpit visibility, structural strength, and outstanding low-altitude climb rate made it the ultimate vertical combat weapon. He ripped up the old manual and wrote his own. It was a tactical masterpiece built on a simple, uncompromising doctrine: altitude, speed, maneuver, and fire. In the skies over the Kuban River in the spring of 1943, Pukrishkin unleashed his tactical revolution, the Kuban bookcase. Instead of flying in vulnerable single-level formations, Pukrishkin stacked his P-39s in pairs at staggered altitudes. When German Bf-109s descended to attack the lower tier, the upper tiers would dive out of the glare of the sun at over 400 miles per hour, striking the Germans in their blind spots. The P-39's mid-engine design provided an exceptionally clear, unobstructed view over the nose, allowing Soviet pilots to track their targets through violent, high-G vertical dives that would have caused other fighters to lose their prey. Pukrishkin's tactics turned the Eastern Air War into a three-dimensional slaughterhouse. While Western pilots complained that the nose-mounted 37mm T9 autocannon had a slow rate of fire and carried only 30 rounds of ammunition, Soviet pilots saw this as an asset of precision. They did not spray bullets from distance. Under Pukrishkin's strict guidance, Soviet aces flew so close to the enemy that they could see the rivets on their fuselages, firing only when they were within 100 meters. At that range, the 37mm high-explosive shell behaved like sniper artillery. A single hit was cataclysmic. When a shell struck a German fighter, the explosive force did not just damage the plane, it detonated with such violence that wings were instantly torn from their roots, engines were ripped from their mounts, and entire cockpits vanished in clouds of black, oil-slicked fire. Soviet pilots called it the hand of God.
The results were indisputable. Flying the Airacobra, Grigory Rekhalov, one of the most aggressive and feared pilots of the VVS, scored 44 of his 56 aerial victories in the P-39, making him the highest-scoring Airacobra pilot in human history. Dmitry Glinka, a legendary ace known for his near-supernatural situational awareness, claimed nearly all of his 50 victories in the American fighter. Alexander Pokrishkin himself scored the vast majority of his 59 confirmed kills in his beloved tail number 100 Airacobra, surviving the war to become a Marshal of Aviation. Of nearly 5,000 P-39s shipped to Russia, more German aircraft were destroyed by this single American import than by any other foreign fighter in history.
It remains one of the ultimate poetic ironies of the Second World War. The fighter, dismissed by its own creators as a useless, underpowered failure. The aircraft, mocked by Western test pilots as a flying coffin, was the exact weapon that broke the back of the Luftwaffe's finest squadrons on the Eastern Front. The P-39 was never a bad airplane. It was simply an aircraft born into the wrong theater of war. When stripped of its high-altitude expectations, modified by rugged frontline mechanics, and placed into the hands of tactical geniuses who understood its low-altitude potential, this rejected American underdog didn't just fly, it conquered. American engineering and Soviet audacity turned a forgotten outcast into a legend. But the P-39 wasn't the only unlikely hero of the Eastern Front. If you want to know how the Soviet Union took a wooden biplane designed for crop dusting, put all-female volunteer crews in the cockpits, and created a silent night bombing regiment that drove German soldiers to the brink of madness, click on the video on your screen right now. Let us know in the comments. Do you think the Western Allies gave up on the Airacobra too soon? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.